We'll start in, we'll start in just a moment. We'll just allow a few more people to join us and then we'll get going. So welcome everybody. Welcome to the third Making Public History seminar for 2024. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building and I'll be your host for this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I thank them for their care of country and of culture and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to extend that respect to any other elders who may be joining us this evening. Making Public Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Monash University History Program, the History Council of Victoria and the Old Treasury Building. Each event aims to explore issues and approaches in making public histories. The seminars are open to anyone who's interested in the creation and impact of history in contemporary society, and I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us this evening. Now, just a brief introduction to the format for the evening, although I know everyone's well versed in webinars by now. But it is a webinar, and so unlike a Zoom meeting, only the presenters and the hosts will be seen and heard. We have two speakers tonight, and each of them has about 20 minutes, and it will be followed by 5 minutes of an individual question and answer session for each speaker. There will also be about 20 minutes at the end with both speakers, and we'll try and see how many issues we can canvass at that time. If you have questions for the presenters, and we do hope you will, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. If you have any technical issues, though, please use the chat button and we'll endeavour to help you. And of course, please keep any questions or comments polite and respectful. If for any reason a presenter's internet connection is slow or disrupted, they may continue with voice only. And finally, just so that you're well aware, we are recording this webinar tonight, and the recording will be made available on the History Council's YouTube site in a few days' time. Now, we have a terrific seminar this evening. I think we can say that historical drama has never been more popular. More people arguably encounter history through film than through any other medium. But how accurate is the history we see on the screen? Should authenticity matter to filmmakers? And what is the role of the historian in advising filmmakers or in critiquing such films? Equally importantly, in difficult, disputed histories, can film sometimes help us to reckon with the past? Now, we'll be trying to explore all of those questions tonight. Our first speaker is Professor Emeritus Peter McPhee. Peter held a personal chair in history at the University of Melbourne for many years. He's a distinguished scholar of revolutionary France, and his most recent book was Liberty or Death, the French Revolution, published in 2016. He is also chair of the History Council of Victoria. And I can't think of anyone who is better to speak to us tonight about accuracy and authenticity, Ridley Scott's Napoleon. Thank you, Peter.
Oh, Margie, thanks very much. And let me just share my screen. Fine. So when Ridley Scott's blockbuster Napoleon was launched last November, people were full of anticipation. Here's the first. Here's the poster of the film showing Napoleon as a man who came from nowhere and conquered everything. The film basically charts the great episodes of Napoleon's life, from his presence at the execution of Marie Antoinette in October 1793, and his successful participation in lifting the siege at Toulon, in rescuing that port city from the English garrison during the Revolutionary Wars later that same year. It follows him through his tumultuous and passionate relationship with Josephine, which began in 1795 and was to be so crucial in his life, through to his disastrous expedition to Egypt in 1798, 1799, from which he fled effectively, only to then organise a coup d'etat back in Paris in 1799. The springboard for a series of astonishing military victories, such as the Battle of Austerlitz in the present-day Czech Republic, until his ignominious defeat in Russia in 1812, the retreat from Moscow, the loss of huge numbers of soldiers, and so on, before his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815 and his exile to St. Helena. Now, the release of the blockbuster unleashed a torrent of objections to historical errors in the movie. Historians pounced to begin with on the trailer, competing to see how many errors they could spot. The most obvious, of course, was that Napoleon wasn't at the execution of Marie Antoinette in 1793, as he was down south commanding forces at Toulon at the time. Social media platforms in particular were inundated with outrage, particularly from military historians, objecting to everything from details on uniforms to military formations. But these heated responses highlighted a more fundamental question. How should historians respond to creative works about history? Do historians have a public responsibility to apply their specialist knowledge to contest spurious or fictitious claims about the past? Or should we simply respect creative license? Certainly there were historians who marvelled at the cinematic opulence of Scott's battle scenes, and I was one of them. Others acknowledged some particular moments in the film which were accurate and convincing, such as the coronation of Napoleon as emperor in Notre Dame in 1804, which reproduced so carefully the details of Jacques-Louis David's famous painting of 1804 of that ceremony, including Napoleon, despite the presence of a rather annoyed-looking Pope in the background, Napoleon anointing Josephine as Empress of the French, captured beautifully in the film. Even the most controversial dimension of that ceremony, which was Napoleon crowning himself in front of the Pope, which David very astutely decided not to turn into a public work of art. Even that is captured beautifully on the screen. But despite episodes like this, in general, historians railed against a plethora of shortcomings and silences and inaccuracies in the movie. And certainly there were plenty of inaccuracies. Here are just a few of them. For example, the film depicts a defeated Napoleon meeting Wellington on board his prison ship in 1815, whereas in actuality, the two men never met. There are inaccuracies in the way that Napoleon's relationship with Josephine is presented, including the timing of their divorce, which was 1809, not 1807. Its nature, Napoleon didn't slap Josephine during it. And its rationale, Josephine is portrayed as accepting the inevitability of the divorce, whereas in reality she was fearful of it and fought against it. Her own death is delayed for a year, simply for dramatic purposes in the movie. Vanessa Kirby, who plays Josephine, is 13 years younger than Joaquin Phoenix. In real life, Josephine was 6 years older than Napoleon Bonaparte. Careful makeup could not disguise the 49-year-old Joaquin Phoenix as the 25-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte, who first came to notice at the Battle of Toulon in 1793. This is the first portrait of Napoleon done in 1797, and he looks, even then, much younger than Phoenix does at any point in the movie. Similarly, the portly middle-aged Robespierre bears no resemblance to the young revolutionary in appearance or style. The film presents Napoleon's troops as firing at the pyramids of Giza, which never happened. In an interview with the Times newspaper, Scott defended his depiction of the attack on the pyramids as, quote, just being a quick way of saying Napoleon took Egypt. Historians have also criticised the depiction of Napoleonic-era battlefield tactics, particularly the sequence at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. There are unforgettable, horrific scenes in the movie of Russian soldiers and their horses crossing a frozen river as French artillery smashed the ice on the river with their cannonballs, leading to horrible deaths by drowning in an icy river of Russian soldiers and horses. In reality, that particular episode in the battle was of very minor significance. Again, Napoleon is often depicted leading cavalry charges, but he was an artillery officer and never personally led a cavalry charge on his white charger, as is shown here in the Battle of Borodino. The movie ignores things such as the atrocities Napoleon's troops committed with his permission at Jaffa in present-day Israel. Major episodes in the Peninsular War in Spain are ignored, as are most of the campaigns through Central Europe in 1813 and 1814. Napoleon's marshals, who played such a crucial role in his victories, are almost absent. Even some of the very deft touches in the movie are inaccurate. When Baudin's voyage returned from Australia in 1804, among the animals they brought back to Josephine's garden at Malmaison in Paris were black swans from Western Australia. The ones that are depicted in the movie happen to be white swans, whereas in fact we know from paintings done by Baudin's artist on board that ship that they were indeed the black swans of Western Australia. Scott himself dismissed these criticisms of historical inaccuracies. To quote him, Napoleon dies, then 10 years later someone writes a book. Then someone takes that book and writes another. And so 400 years later, I think he meant 200 years later, there's a lot of imagination in history books. When I have issues with historians, he said, I ask, excuse me, mate, were you there? No? Well, shut the fuck up then. Scott also declared, responding to his French critics, that, quote, the French don't even like themselves. Why would they like Napoleon? By the way, when working on the film, Scott, here pictured on the left, had two very prominent historians, one British, one French, as advisors. So that in itself is no necessary protection against historical inaccuracy. But similar, if less strident, objections may be made about all historical recreations on film or in theatre. For example, in the celebrated Australian movie The Dish in 2000, Rob Sitch and his team located the first reception of news of the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969 and of Neil Armstrong's famous words about his one small step at the iconic Parkes Observatory in New South Wales. In reality, those messages were received at the NASA stations at Honeysuckle Creek near Canberra and in California. Cinematic attraction trumped accuracy. Nor was there in actuality the friction with NASA representatives in the movie, which served to appeal further to audiences in Australia. Far more controversial was the scintillating musical Hamilton, created by Lin-Manuel Miranda, based on the prize-winning 2004 biography of Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. Miranda explicitly recognised that the musical was his interpretation of the founding of the United States from today's perspective, and deliberately cast non-white actors as the founding fathers, and drew on musical styles ranging from R&B to soul and hip-hop. But despite his candour, historians rush to point out errors, exaggerations, and elisions. For example, Hamilton's contributions to the battlefield during the American War of Independence were exaggerated for effect. The Schuyler sisters articulate feminist ideas far from those they would have had at the time. While Miranda makes much of Hamilton's opposition to slavery, Hamilton, in fact, was personally involved in purchasing slaves, and his wife Elizabeth came from a wealthy slave-owning family. Most recently, Chevalier is an American biographical drama film based on the extraordinary life of the French Caribbean musician Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. The illegitimate son of an African slave and a French plantation owner, Bologne rose to improbable heights in French society on the eve of the French Revolution as a celebrated violinist, composer, and fencer, complete with an ill-fated love affair at court and a falling out with Marie Antoinette herself. Chevalier opens with this musical duel between Joseph Bologne and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who was, according to the film, conducting a concert when the Chevalier de Saint-Georges comes in and begins playing the violin, upstaging Mozart in front of the audience. While it's a thrilling way to start the movie, there's no evidence that Bologne participated in a violin duel with Mozart, let alone that he inserted jazz notes as women of the court passed out in sensual rapture. Chevalier's ending sees Bologne putting on a concert to fund revolutionary efforts. Marie Antoinette was so displeased by this turn of events, she gave orders to have him shot during the performance. Again, it's a dramatic, overpowering ending. However, there's no evidence suggesting that there were orders to shoot Joseph while he was in concert. Like Scott's Napoleon, these are films or plays which have been criticised for playing fast and loose with historical accuracy. But Ridley Scott, Rob Stitch, and Lin-Manuel Miranda created works within different genres to that of professional history. They were not creating documentaries that can be evaluated according to the historical conventions of the careful use of available evidence and respect for ambiguity and uncertainty. They need to be considered first and foremost as creative works. As Scott snapped, the fact-checkers should get a life and join the crowds enjoying his personal interpretation. Scott was even accused of legitimizing the rewriting of history by Trump, Putin, and Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. But instead, we might celebrate the fact that a long historical drama about Napoleon Bonaparte has been an immediate box office success, including in France. Those who attended were more likely to be curious to know more rather than simply being gullible about its historical accuracy. However, there are many serious objections that one can make to Napoleon, and notably about three particular silences in the movie. And it's those that I want to turn to now. The first of them is about Napoleon's background and youth. Remember in the poster for the film that Napoleon is described as someone who came from nowhere, but conquered everywhere. The film would have been far richer had Scott dwelt on the particular circumstances of Napoleon's birth and upbringing. As a Corsican, born in this house in Ajaccio, to a noble family, it has to be said, but to a minor noble family, certainly someone who grew up far from the great chateaus of the French aristocracy. When he was a little boy of just 8 years old, or 9 years old, he was sent to this military school in central France at Brienne-le-Château. A little boy of 9 who struggled to speak French. He spoke Corsican, and it was a miserable 5 years at this officer training school for aristocrat sons. He was mocked as Napoleone Bonaparte, who didn't speak French properly, mocked for his accent, effectively bullied, we would say. And it seems to me that Scott misses a very important opportunity by ignoring the circumstances of Napoleon's birth and upbringing to draw out the ways in which the experience at a tough officer training school like this marked his attitudes towards privilege, towards aristocracy, ever after. There's a second significant silence about Napoleon that would have enriched the film greatly. And that is to do with the significance of plantation slavery in the French colonies across the Atlantic, in the colonies of the Caribbean, particularly in the western third of this island of Saint-Domingue, in Martinique and Guadeloupe, where there were as many as 500,000 slaves being ruled by French plantation owners in the 18th century. Significantly, Josephine herself came from a slave-owning plantation family in Martinique. What's really crucial about this in terms of the film and its silence is that in 1791, the slave population of Saint-Domingue began a massive and extremely bloody insurrection against those plantation owners, resulting in the loss of scores of thousands of lives on both sides. Ultimately, in that insurrection, inspired by the Declaration of the Rights of Man of 1789, resulted by 1794 in the French revolutionary government abolishing slavery in the Caribbean colonies. What's of crucial importance but missing in Scott's film is that in 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte decided to reverse that abolition of slavery and to invade Saint-Domingue to reimpose it. It was an ignominious failure, and in 1804, local troops, former slaves, led by Toussaint Louverture, forced Napoleon and his armies to withdraw. And the first post-colonial nation, independent nation of Haiti, was born. Scott misses a real opportunity to talk about that great failure of Napoleon's and to link it more closely with his relationship with Josephine. Even more important, perhaps, is the third silence that I want to reflect on, and that is what Napoleon regarded as the greatest legacy of his rule, and that is the production of the Napoleonic or Civil Code in 1804, which was a synthesis of all the revolutionary laws and reforms into a single corpus, the basis of French and even European law even today. It's depicted here in this, what is effectively a work of propaganda by Jacques-Louis David in 1813, with the Napoleonic Code on the desk behind Napoleon, showing Napoleon the statesman rather than the general. The clock set at 4:15, the candle almost burnt down, shows the emperor's devotion to his people, working through the night to give them a durable body of revolutionary reform. Crucially, Napoleon Bonaparte was a product of the French Revolution and owed his meteoric rise to its smashing of old hierarchies of birth and family status. Just as he himself would never have reached the position he did in the French army were it not for the French Revolution, so it's striking that so many of his marshals and generals, in fact, were promoted from the ranks as commoners to begin with. This leads me to the key point that I want to make in my presentation, and that is that rather than focusing on inaccuracies and silences in creative works about the past, we should focus on what, to my mind, is the most important question of all, and that is of authenticity. Scott's film mirrors 19th century British propaganda, denigrating Napoleon as a Corsican ruffian. The film ignores Napoleon's numerous non-military achievements, as well as his popularity with the French people. Napoleon was known for his passion for literature and Enlightenment thought, a far cry from the boorish, loutish soldier that Scott depicts. Of course, historians need to point to failings of historical veracity, but the central issue for us, it seems to me, should be authenticity, whether a creative work rings true. That is, a creative work, such as a film, should be evaluated by historians not so much as to whether specific details are accurate, but as to whether the producer's imagination has captured the essence of the historical moment. Poetic license in creative works permits selectivity and exaggeration in the interest of evoking a deeper meaning. Of course, that cannot excuse deliberate distortion unless, as in Miranda's case, it's openly acknowledged. Napoleon claimed that his greatest achievement for France was this Napoleonic Code, and consideration of that code might have also given Scott an opportunity to consider one of the striking characteristics of that code, which is its patriarchal assumptions, the coding of double standards in family law and rights to divorce. His depiction of Josephine in this setting misses a rare opportunity. It seems to me, as it does to other biographers of Napoleon, that central to that Napoleonic code and its patriarchal assumptions about the place of the male head of household is the stormy, fractured, combative relationship that Napoleon and Josephine had. One where power in that relationship, in fact, oscillates from one to the other. Scott misses an opportunity to explore further the relationship between Napoleon and Josephine in terms of the way it's reflected in the assumptions inbuilt into that Napoleonic code about the way the family should be governed by its male head of household. Of course, the restrictions of film as a genre require directors to be highly selective in what they choose to portray, as well as imaginative in how they portray it. While we may regret that Ridley Scott's portrayal of Napoleon is lopsided and grossly selective, what this really means is that the film fails to give an authentic sense of the man and his world. In other words, it lacks the feel of truth. So the real weakness of Napoleon is that the failure to ground the emperor's motivations in the principles underpinning the Napoleonic Code, as well as his megalomania, means that the explanations for his behaviour boil down to a mixture of murderous territorial greed and a pathetic need to impress Josephine. The problem with the movie is not so much the myriad errors of detail, but the silence about Napoleon's worldview. In the end, Scott's is an old-fashioned 19th century skewed British view of the Corsican ogre, whose only moods were buffoonish vulgarity or grotesque rage. It lacks authenticity. Thank you.
Peter, thank you. That was terrific. Now, I note that we already have a couple of questions, which is a great sign. That doesn't always happen. So that augurs very well. But with your indulgence, we may save those to the end. And there was one question, Peter, that I actually am very interested in because I think that was such a perceptive analysis of what was right and what was wrong with the film Napoleon. Is there a film that you've seen that you think is perhaps more successful in creating the authenticity that you think is missing from Napoleon?
Yes, I've thought hard about this, and there are several that spring to mind. But I guess my favourite, and it's really going to date me terribly, Margie. I'm sorry, but it goes all the way back to the 1970s. I mean, we've been regretting in recent weeks, haven't we, the death of that great Canadian film actor, Donald Sutherland. But one of the films that very few people commented on that he'd starred in was the Bernardo Bertolucci film 1900, which came out in 1976. And in that film, the young Donald Sutherland plays an early 20th century Italian fascist. Now, that's a movie which tries to create the social and political circumstances in the aftermath of the First World War that created the conditions for the emergence of Mussolini and fascism in Italy. And it takes us all the way up until the aftermath of the Second World War and the fracturing of the resistance and all the rest of it. And Sutherland plays beautifully a sort of an archetypal young fascist sympathizer with his masculine braggadocio and his violence and all the rest of it. Now, that's a film which, when I saw it and when I've looked at it again since, really impressed me greatly for that sense of authenticity. It just made me have this powerful sense of, I understand watching this film where the drive for fascism and opposition to it came from. It just rang true to me. The dilemma, however, is that the film is so beautifully made, so carefully made, and so historically careful as well. It's terribly long. I mean, the first cut of 1900 was 5 hours.
Oh.
And it was only when Bertolucci was told that you can't expect people to go to the movies for 5 hours, and he had to cut it in half. And that's, of course, one of the dilemmas for historical movies is that they have to be extremely selective in what they can hope to depict. But that would be my
Particularly,
favourite.
yeah, well, now that's really interesting. And it also introduces that question that when you're dealing with such a period and such a canvas and such an incredible tapestry of events, as in the life of Napoleon, how on earth do you capture that with any degree of realism? And how do you do justice to so many encounters
Yeah.
without it becoming, my sense of it was that some of it was almost a little two-dimensional. It was just so quick. You went from one event to the next to the next, and all you had at the bottom was a little thing that said, Paris 1797, or, and that's not enough.
No, and he had to find some way of perhaps reducing the battle scenes to allow for those three key silences in the film that I've highlighted.
Yes.
That just would have made the evocation of, what made this extraordinary man tick, and what were the great paradoxes and ambiguities and dramas of his life. As you say, Margie, it seems to me that the film is sort of two-dimensional. Here's this man of extraordinary territorial ambition uh, who's a violent buffoon in some ways, and that's the nature of his love life with Josephine as well in the movie. But it just misses the great drama of his life in terms of his commitment to Enlightenment principles, but at the same time his extraordinary attitude towards slavery and to patriarchy, which just would have made for a much more satisfying film without making it much longer, it seemed to me.
Yes, interesting. Well, let's hold those thoughts. Thank you, Peter, very much, both for a wonderful paper and for some really interesting discussion. Thank you. Now I'm going to invite our next speaker, James Findlay, if he would please turn on his microphone and he can begin to activate his PowerPoint too. Dr. James Findlay, who is an associate lecturer in history at the University of Sydney. He's also a filmmaker. His research interest is in historical film and its intersection with public history. And his first book, Caught on Screen, Australia's Convict History in Film and Television, is due for release next year. His paper tonight is entitled Reckoning with Colonisation in the Nightingale. Thank you, James.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I want to advise that the slideshow I'm presenting contains the images of deceased people. So, set in 1825, against the turbulent backdrop of the eve of the Black War in Van Diemen's Land, The Nightingale is a harrowing account of the colonisation of Van Diemen's Land and the toll that it wrought on all who lived there. The film opens with Irish convict woman Claire, who works as a servant for a colonial force detachment, where at the hands of a visiting officer, Lieutenant Hawkins, and later two of his subordinates, she is subjugated to a series of harrowing rapes. The second rape sequence, within that sequence, Claire's convict husband and baby are forced to watch on, and both are eventually murdered by the soldiers who are taking part in the rape, including Hawkins. It's a level of on-screen violence that was so shocking that it famously prompted walkouts in screenings in Australia and around the world. Claire's quest for revenge drives the subsequent narrative, which begins with her enlisting the help of Billy, a letter mariner man and a trucker who agrees to help Claire find Hawkins. And they both together journey north to find Hawkins to the township of Launceston. As they travel through the Gothically rendered Vandemonian frontier, they are forced to confront the traumas and depravity of a colony in the throes of violent dispossession, and in doing so, come to terms with their own place and victimhood in the harsh and brutal world of 1820s Van Diemen's Land. If the reviews are anything to go by, for many, The Nightingale was a revelation. The history of the Black War, let alone representations of Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s, is a subject little explored in popular culture, and the film gives audiences an in-depth and I think at times admirably accurate glimpse into a period of Australia's past that is much studied but rarely put to screen. Of the various historical encounters offered up to moviegoers, it is the relationship between convict Claire and Tasmanian Aboriginal man Billy that is at the film's heart. And it comes to us attached to a longer popular tradition, one that, if we investigate, reveals a range of historical tropes concerning convict Aboriginal encounters that have helped to shape an understanding of the processes and outcomes of settler colonialism throughout the 20th and 21st century. As such, my talk today is concerned with the film The Nightingale, but also where it sits within a kind of broader tradition of on-screen representations of Aboriginal people and convicts. And in doing so, I wish to explore three lines of inquiry. Firstly, by locating the film's Aboriginal convict partnership within this kind of representational history, exploring how the Nightingale then conforms or ruptures to kind of narrative patterns, I guess, and tropes that have developed over time around such encounters. And finally, and briefly, I want to investigate how the specifics of Billy and Claire's convict Aboriginal partnership function as a way of reconciling the past in the present moment. Historically speaking, cross-cultural relationships between Aboriginal people and convicts played out in a variety of ways, from peaceful stories of fraternizing. Oh, sorry, here's some images from the Nightingale. I didn't have that slide marked in my notes. So historically speaking, cross-cultural relationships between Aboriginal people and convicts played out in a variety of ways, from the peaceful stories of fraternizing cohabitation that pepper early records, to more brutal encounters resulting from the rapid expansion of pastoral capitalism that embedded convict labour in the cycles of violence that characterised Australia's frontier. Peaceful encounters also occurred, sometimes for long periods, and the most celebrated of these have been situated within stories of convict escape. In such instances, convicts were known to adopt clan names, hunt, share cultural knowledge, start families, and even fight alongside Aboriginal people against the British. William Buckley, of course, a convict who lived with the Wathaurong near Port Phillip Bay for 32 years and had his memoir published in numerous editions and his life memorialised by both Aboriginal and European artists in the mid-19th century, as we see here, is sort of one of the kind of key figures, I guess, in sort of helping to embed this trope. These sorts of visual representations, along with popular accounts of similar escapees, gave rise to the archetype of the wild European, a representation with enduring legacies for a popular understanding of the convict and Aboriginal relationship. Screen culture, film and television too, has presented such encounters with remarkable assuredness and a surprising level of consistency when you start looking for them, taking and adapting stories primarily from escape narratives such as Buckley. Most of these imagined relationships result from an inciting incident involving trauma enacted upon the convict body, as is the case with the Nightingale's much commented upon opening 20 minutes. In turn, this leads to the convict protagonist escaping assignment or imprisonment, moving away from so-called settled spaces into the Australian bush, as Claire does. And it is in this cinematic landscape that relationships between Aboriginal people and convicts play out. In most cases, Aboriginal people act as saviours, rescuing convicts from certain death, allowing them to access First Nations knowledges and landscapes, and then retreating from the story. Such cross-cultural encounters have been presented to moviegoers as early as the silent era. We can see here an example of this. They then become popular again in the revival period of Australian cinema and television in the 1970s and 80s. We see here one of the first of these partnerships in W.J. Lincoln's Moondine, a 1913 silent film, which is a story of a convict brutally treated by his master, who escapes into the Vasai Valley and assimilates into an Aboriginal tribe as an ancient gold. While a completely fictitious plot, it was also one of the first very detailed visions of an Aboriginal society presented to Australian moviegoers in a dramatic feature, and it's interested that it is told through the eyes of a convict. Flash forward to the revival period of the 1970s and 1980s, and we see very similar scenarios playing out both in film and television. Tom Birstall's Ocker historical romp, the popular Eliza Fraser film, where we have here John Waters depicted as the escaped convict David Bracewell, who flees torture and sexual assault on Moreton Bay. He falls in with an Aboriginal group on Gari, then popularly known as Fraser Island. Here we have Dinny O'Brien from the phenomenally successful television miniseries Against the Wind, who bolts into the bush after the ill-fated Castle Hill Rebellion, and through a union with a lone Aboriginal woman named Ngilgi, quickly adapts to life outside of the colony and secures sanctuary. In the ABC historical miniseries based on Eleanor Dark's novel series The Timeless Land, escaped convict Johnny Prentice also lives alongside Aboriginal people, establishing an almost idyllic lifestyle through his relationship with them, away from the horrors of penal life. In Euron Gross's The Little Convict, we again see the film's protagonist Toby escape prison into the bush and befriend an Aboriginal, this time boy, Wurrunga, who helps him to survive and later expose the violent antics of the crooked redcoats to the governor. There are other similar representations that I don't have time to go into tonight, but I think what's notable in these relationships is the way in which white protagonists, because of their class, possess a unique ability to form meaningful relationships with Aboriginal people where other European characters, often singled out as the British or as elites, cannot. In earlier silent films, we see they sort of reinforce contemporary ideas about Aboriginal society being exotic, primitive and homogenous, but also easily assimilated into by convict heroes, a trope that is then repeated in later revival representations, which became increasingly tied to a nationalist reading of the convict class. Here, parallels are explicitly drawn between the worldviews of convicts and Aboriginal people as suffering under colonisation. For example, in Against the Wind, links are drawn between Aboriginal dreaming of Ngilgi and the Irish mysticism of the convicts, as well as the more obvious shared trauma caused by the displacement of Aboriginal and Irish lands by the British. The revival films also use these relationships to comment on the nature of colonial society itself, with a view from the outside. Having a foot in both worlds meant that on-screen convicts were uniquely placed to deliver a repeated critique of the civilization project being brought to Australia by the British, often holding it up against the more preferable natural orders experienced by their relationship with Aboriginal people. I want to pause for a moment on a film that is best placed to explore these ideas and I think echoes most directly to the scenarios and motivations present with the Nightingale. I'll return to the Nightingale itself in the time that I have left. And that is a film that was made in 1978 called Journey Among Women. Directed by Tom Cohen, the film is set in an unnamed penal colony and follows a group of convict women who, after being repeatedly abused and raped by their jailers, orchestrate an escape into the bush. And here they establish their own society, free from the patriarchal hierarchies of colonial life that have kept them brutalized. Importantly, and as with the other texts I have discussed, it is their relationship with an Aboriginal character, another lone figure named Cameragal, which facilitates the convict woman's survival through her sharing where to find water and where and how to hunt and live in harmony with the land. With the utopian convict world brought into existence by her knowledge, Cameragal disappears from the film's narrative. And when the redcoats finally track down the convict women, the film reaches its conclusion by shifting gears into a violent revenge fantasy. The convicts paint their faces with ochre, they arm themselves with spears and bows and arrows, and in a climactic battle mercilessly murder the soldiers sent to capture them. Like other representations I've touched on, class is again an important aspect of the film and its convict and Aboriginal partnership. Membership of the convict class is central to Aboriginal appropriation in Journey Among Women, something that is highlighted by the presence of Elizabeth Harrington, who is a woman that joins the group of escapees, but is actually the daughter of the judge advocate and is not a convict, therefore. And so she initially flees kind of male oppression with them, but instead of kind of learning to live in the bush, she detests living like what she calls a savage, and instead returns to the colony, which she does so before the kind of final battle takes place. Meanwhile, the convicts flourish in their new environment and embrace the possibilities it presents for their future. As Ian McLean and Anthony Lambert have noted, there is a tendency in Australian art and cinema to fashion new and authentic national identities through representing white characters, mimicking states of Aboriginality. This white Aboriginal trope, as they label it, transforms what is represented on screen as Aboriginal nativism into a distinctive anti-imperial Indigenous culture that is accessible to white Australian viewers. Russell Ward's Australian Legend, that important kind of tome of Australian national myth-making in the 1950s, was an early text to link this idea to the figure of the convict. Ward argued that a typical Australian ethos, separate from British history, could trace its lineage to convict workers, whose experiences in the Australian landscape transmuted them into something new. McLean has argued Ward's New Australian was a white Aboriginal person sprung from the land itself, a vision that displaces Aboriginality within a white indigeneity. Journey Among Women arguably executes such displacement and appropriation in order to realise its vision of female emancipation and revenge. Like The Nightingale, Journey Among Women was a controversial piece of cinema when it first screened in 1978, yet very little of the commentary in the 1970s focused on the film's representation of race. Rather, it was on its overt feminist politics that drew attention from critics and audiences. Film director Tom Hayden worked with feminist poet, novelist, and playwright Dorothy Hewitt in initial drafts of the script, and intentionally cast the convict women from a mixed pool of professional actors and local radical feminists. The scenario that emerged came from both the film's script and the unique production process that drew on the director workshopping scenes with his actors in situ. The narrative of a united sisterhood existing in a utopian society free from the oppression of a male-dominated colony reflected wider discourses concerning gender politics of the period. Sequences in the film, such as the graphic sexual exploitation of convict women by a group of soldiers, spoke to the contemporary political agenda, as well as an emerging historiography concerning the widespread brutality experienced by women in colonial Australia, most notably Miriam Dixon's New Matilda and Anne Summers' popular historical work, Downpours and God's Police, published 1 year earlier, which was a direct influence on Hewitt's screenplay. Actors involved in Journey Among Women's production, as well as commentators, both at the time of the film's release and more recently, have critiqued Journey Among Women's pleasantly rude sequences of convict women kissing and bathing in rivers, arguing that they reflect the cheap titillation present in the so-called Ozploitation films of the period, and therefore subverted its intended feminist message. So it's interesting that much of the focus on the film, both in the 1970s and more recently, it's sort of become, I guess, one of those revival films that's come back in fashion. It's had a couple of international film screenings and has appeared on the Australian screening circuit as well. Much of the focus of the discourse has been still, even now, on the film's kind of representation of gender, or the gender politics of the film. Journey Among Women in many ways was radical in its depiction of gender through convictism, but incredibly conservative in relation to its representation of Aboriginality. The film and subsequent media commentary, both then and more recently, maintain, I think, what is a somewhat myopic feminist perspective that is curiously silent on the problems inherent in its displacement and appropriation of Aboriginal culture afforded by the convict Aboriginal partnership present in its story. It has been left to scholars, I think, to rightly point to these problems, as well as the broader issues at play with equating both the femininity of Cammeraygal and the convict women solely within the sphere of the natural world. Placing this film within the context of other Aboriginal partnerships on screen allows us to see that whilst Journey Among Women and its feminist politics meant that its critique of white colonial authority was far more pointed than previous representations dealing with similar subject matter, such as, say, Eliza Fraser, its convict characters appropriated Aboriginal culture in a more definitive way. Whereas earlier convict escapees such as Braceville and Moondyne assimilated on screen into established Aboriginal societies, the convict women in Cowan's film become Aboriginal and in the process take possession of both the traditions of Aboriginal culture and the colonial history. Flash forward to The Nightingale, and we see again a narrative of convict escape and revenge, featuring an Aboriginal convict partnership that explores issues of gender and violence situated in the Australian bush. This time, the representation between Billy and Claire takes centre stage, allowing for a much more complex and detailed examination of shared victimhood and culpability in colonisation. Though The Nightingale at times follows multiple strands of narrative, it is Claire and Billy's developing relationship that forms the spine of the film's emotional journey. A fact noted by reviewers, such as Film Week's Amy Nicholson, who wrote that, quote, "The pleasure of this movie is slowly watching its leads find their common ground." Similarly, in The Guardian, Larissa Behrendt has written that the relationship functions as an important on-screen space in which to explore the shared trauma and loss each character has suffered at the hands of white men. I want to return to Behrendt's critique in a moment, but firstly, I think it's helpful to note the genesis of the film as according to its director. So in her own words, the film's director, Jennifer Kent, wrote, quote, "I wanted to tell a story about violence, in particular the fallout of violence from a feminine perspective. Colonization by nature is a brutal act, she writes, and the arrogance that drives it lives on in the modern world. For this reason, I consider The Nightingale to be a current story, despite it being set in the past. In many ways, Kent's motives, as articulated here and seen in the film itself, echo those of the 1970s feminist historians whose project it was to rewrite Australian colonial history as a way of understanding the origins of contemporary gender inequalities. The metaphor of colonisation at the heart of Anne Summers' Damned Whores and God's Police references exactly the kind of violent acts perpetrated on convict women's bodies that Claire experiences in The Nightingale, violence that Kent similarly hoped the film would highlight as an existing problem today. This focus on a brutal vision of the female convict experience inherently makes a powerful statement about gender, but, as it did with Summers' book and Cowan's Journey Among Women, has left some questioning whether or not it sidelines the First Nations experience of colonisation. To return to Berendt's critique, she argues that Kent has, quote, misguidedly stepped into a minefield by falsely equivocating two vastly different experiences, that of Claire and Billy, a convict woman and an Aboriginal man. It is dangerous, Berendt argues, to link those marginalised within the colonial state to those being colonised. Drawing such a comparison between the victimhood of Aboriginal people and convicts is, as I've argued, a repeated idea that extends back to the very beginnings of cinema in this country. Acknowledging these patterns, I think, helps not only to place The Nightingale within the tradition of convict Aboriginal screen partnerships that exists, but also highlights how the film serves to disrupt these patterns of representation. And I think this is where part of its revisionist power lies. Turning our attention back to the film's convict Aboriginal partnership, The Nightingale does draw comparisons between the suffering of its convict heroine and Aboriginal lead through their shared experience of violence. This is part of the film's mission. But there are important differences in the way this experience is revealed and the consequences of it for each character were compared to previous representations. We know from the brutal opening scenes that Claire is very much a victim, yet the full scale of Billy's tragedy becomes clearer the closer the pair get to Launceston, and the film for a section becomes about Billy more than it does Claire, particularly towards the end. In this sort of ending, I guess, third act of the film, we learn the magnitude of Billy's suffering when we discover, following news of a massacre, that he is the last of his people. Whilst there is a similarity in terms of Billy and Claire's loss of family to the violence of colonisation, Billy is staring into the abyss of cultural annihilation, a fact that he defiantly protests in the final scene during his dance on the beach. The film's ending also highlights the difference in terms of the outcomes of cycles of violence, and a spoiler alert here for those who've not seen the film. Though ambiguous, it suggests that Claire survives the ordeal of revenge, while Billy is mortally wounded and will not. The consequences for the colonised are therefore much more severe, as the film concludes. Finally, the other obvious disruption is the deviation away from portraying Aboriginal characters as facilitating long-term convict survival in the Australian landscape through the appropriation of their culture. This is something that is neither sought by Claire nor offered by Billy. Kent's adoption of the Tasmanian Gothic mode and the film's setting within the violence of the Black War makes any refuge for a convict, especially a woman, within the Vandemonian landscape an impossibility. This is an important shift. Perceptions about who can and cannot exist within the Australian historical landscape have been key to understanding and in some case justifying enduring national myths about the colonisation of Australia. The figure of the convict in The Nightingale may over time learn to sympathise with her Aboriginal co-traveller, but this affords her no special claim to settler belonging, unlike almost all other Aboriginal convict partnerships on screen before. This could be argued as simply a sign of the times in which issues of race and colonial histories have emerged as urgent and sustained political and social discourses in the media and elsewhere. Yet in recent years, historical dramas have continued to represent such convict belonging whilst also addressing themes of frontier violence. This can be seen in the ABC's much-lauded adaptation of The Secret River, which concludes with convicts Will and Sal Thornhill living out their days on their homestead built on dispossessed Aboriginal land. Furthermore, the ubiquitous trope of convict victimhood is present on our screens, assuaging guilt and speaking to the virtues of colonisation through stories of convicts overcoming the odds and making good, as can be seen in the British-made television series Banished in 2015 and the Australian documentary Death or Liberty, which both presented convicts as the natural inheritors of the land through hard work, suffering, or political agitation. Claire's position in the Nightingale seems to be antithetical to such ideas. Her future is much less certain. How can she be a nation builder when the whole project of nation building is predicated on the genocide she and we as a result have witnessed? In this way, the Nightingale reflects continuing trends in Australian screen culture that have foregrounded the Aboriginal experience of history to speak to contemporary race relations. This shift has had important resonance in Australia, in particular at the time of the Nightingale's release, which followed soon after the Uluru Statement from the Heart was issued to the public in the wake of the First Nations Cultural Constitutional Convention in May 2017. Among other reforms, the statement called for a Makarrata Commission to supervise the making of treaty and truth-telling about our history. Truth-telling was envisaged as a process in which all Australians, First Nations and non-Indigenous would confront the violence and traumatic history of colonisation together to correct the record and foster public understanding. Cinematic remembering, such as the Nightingale, gesture to this mode of truth-telling. As Aboriginal consultant and associate producer on the film, Jim Everett recalled, his decision to work and to consult as a cultural advisor on the Nightingale rested on its ability to present the past in a truthful way, stating, quote, "You rarely see the truth being told, even in documentaries about what happened in Tasmania, that there was a definite attempt at genocide. I felt that as a fiction, it reflected real history, and so I should give it my support." For convicts on screen, the Nightingale was also important because it ruptured persistent representational patterns of convict Aboriginal partnerships in frontier spaces. Concerningly, the presence of Aboriginal partnerships, a white victimology tethered to a convict protagonist persists, but while Claire remains a casualty of colonisation, this time her suffering shares the screen with Billy's. As we have seen in the past, such representations work to silence the trauma of the colonised by extolling the hardships of the coloniser. Claire's story, however, does not end in settlement, nor is it tied to any nation-making narrative born through her struggle. Instead, it is the ferocity of frontier violence which characterises the nation-making project the film presents, an important change to the kind of meaning that convict histories in cinema can impart about Australia's founding settler society. Thank you.
James, thank you. That was just terrific and so thoughtful, thought-provoking, obviously. Thank you very much. Now, while I'm just chatting to James for a few minutes, can I just invite all of you to start entering any questions you have into the Q&A for either or both speakers? And we already have quite a few questions in there, I've noted, so we will certainly get to those very quickly. One quick question, James. Do you think that taking Peter's notion of historical authenticity, I thought it was interesting, Jim Everett's comment was fascinating, but also Jane Kent's claim that historical accuracy was important to her, even though the actual characters and events are fictional. Do you think in this case she succeeds in capturing the authenticity through the fiction?
Yes, I do. And I think, I mean, it's interesting. We held a symposium about this film soon after it was released, and the historian Kristen Harman, who's written a bit about sort of Tasmanian Aboriginal history, did a kind of deep dive into the authenticity or not of the particular representations, particularly with regards to the film's sort of extreme sort of violent bent, which is very present on screen. And she came to the conclusion that if anything, the film kind of underdoes the violence of the era. And that actually it was fairly representationally accurate. I mean, I still have issues, you know, the historian in me is always going to have issues with accuracy. You know, Peter, I think, really nicely kind of enunciated the way in which historians often find sort of, you know, we get upset in terms of authenticity and you know, I'm really interested. I'd love to ask Peter a question about, you know, what he thinks the silences in the Napoleon story tell us about the way in which he's constantly remembered as this particular kind of figure and why that persists over time. But as someone who writes about film and is sort of really invested in this notion of, you know, given, as you mentioned, Margaret, the majority of people get their kind of historical sort of memory, I guess, or understanding through popular culture in this way. I think as historians, we have a real stake in understanding the ways and means that this takes place. And so therefore, I'm not less concerned about authenticity, but I think authenticity is actually really interesting. And instead of getting angry, we should actually rush to it as a site of meaning to explore the way in which, particular ideas about particular histories are present in popular culture at that moment and what that tells us about the way that historical memory is working. So.
Yeah, indeed. And tell me, as a filmmaker, I mean, it's an interesting combination, historian and filmmaker. Have you ever had to choose as a filmmaker the drama, if you like, over the historical authenticity or accuracy?
You always have to do that as a filmmaker, unfortunately, because film operates in a very different way to academic history. It's all about the person, and it's all about the emotional journey, and it's all about, I mean, I think there are some things that film does better than history in terms of presenting information. I think you can tell a lot more in a 5-second shot of, a sort of, say, a main street in a Wild West. You can give a lot of historical information in a kind of 5-second panning shot in terms of, outfits and architecture and all sort of animals and all that kind of stuff. But yes, I mean, Peter again sort of mentioned this, that cinema is limited in the way in which it does history. I mean, I was primarily a documentary maker, and I would have to contest the notion that documentaries in any way are more accurate than feature films. I think there is a lot of historical license that goes on with documentary making as well. I think documentarians absolutely place historical emphasis in a way that I think can skew the truth in order to present a sensational story, perhaps in the same way that a feature film director might.
Gosh, there's another paper.
Yes,
I can see that coming.
Yes.
Terrific. Peter, I'm going to invite you now, please, if you would join us. And I wonder whether either of you has a question that you would like to direct to the other. Is there something that you've been burning to ask while you've been listening?
Oh, one question I had of James, because he's such a significant historian of a film about Australia, which he demonstrated this evening, was one of my favourite Australian films, I have to say, is The Proposition, which came out in 2005. And even though the Indigenous experience is not central to that, James, it's plainly there, and it does have some very significant Indigenous actors such as Scott Lil and Leah Purcell. What do you make of a movie like that, which, I mean, I found compelling in the sense of the way it evoked the violence of the frontier on one level?
Yep. Yeah, I like the Proposition as well, Peter. I think it's a good film in many ways. I think it's stylistically so rich, and the world it creates is so sumptuous and interesting, and in many ways kind of fresh. And I think it really is a part of this kind of I guess revisionist sort of moment in Australian Westerns that's taking place. It sort of happened in the States in, say, like, I guess, like this possibly like a few decades ago in the 90s, we had the kind of arrival of the revisionist Western. But the Proposition, Leah Purcell's recent The Drover's Wife, Warwick Thornton's Sweet Country, we are seeing now this kind of way in which the Western, or the Australian Western, which used to operate very much as a kind of I guess, genre that reinforce narratives of settler colonialism, celebratory narratives of settler colonialism, is now emerging as a real kind of cinematic critique of the settler process in Australia. And I think that's really interesting. And The Proposition does that in spades.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And can I ask Peter a question? I just wanted to know.
Yes,
I mean, I'm just fascinated about.
Then we'll get to our questions, which are mounting up there.
Sure. But just very quickly, I'm just really interested in your take, Peter, about the way in which, you kind of say that this is this very almost traditional, the Corsican ogre, this kind of 19th century British understanding of Napoleon. Why does this particular understanding of Napoleon still persist? What does that tell us about the way in which Napoleon continues to be understood now, perhaps through time? Has he ever been understood differently? I guess I'm really interested in the obstinacy of that idea of Napoleon and the way it's visioned again, because it's weird. I mean, all that stuff you were talking about, the silence of slavery and stuff, it would seem now would be the perfect moment to explore all that stuff on screen, and incredibly, as you say, incredibly missed opportunity from the director there.
Oh, that's right. I mean, I think the central ambiguities at the heart of the Napoleonic experience are ones that have never been captured on film, and they're profoundly dramatic, much more so than the sort of rather cardboard cutout view that Scott gives us. I think he's playing to a particular audience. I think it's very much his Anglo way of perceiving Napoleon, which is so deeply embedded in British historiography, and that is he was this. After all, he was one of the greatest threats to English independence ever in its history. He was the sort of the mortal enemy of Britain, and Britain played a crucial role in his ultimate overthrow. So I think this idea of that appeals to Scott, that here is this extraordinarily ambitious, aggressive, successful imperialist who ultimately gets his comeuppance from the Duke of Wellington. I think he can't really escape from that trope. Whereas in France, where he's probably, in terms of opinion polls, the most important French person ever, they tend to drop away. They tend to drop away the failures and emphasize rather more that he was the man who had the biggest European empire ever and was only brought down by perfidious Albion in the end. That they're two sides of the same coin. Whereas I think you're absolutely right, James, that given the increasing emphasis that we have these days, in particular on global history and the history of slavery and so on, there are much more interesting ways of thinking about this period.
Perhaps I might just leap in with one question, which is follows on from that very nicely, actually, Peter, and it's from David. He says, can you summarize what was your French Napoleon historians' reaction to their most famous French historical figure through this film?
Oh, they were outraged, in particular about the absence of the Napoleonic Code. I mean, the French historians, like me, would see the single most important drama of this whole period as being the clash between Napoleon's deep assumptions about the universality of the principles of the French Revolution, and his desire to take those across Europe, which of course comes at a staggering cost of life. The Napoleonic Wars result in the death of 3 or 4 million people. And the greatest single tragedy, and it's an heroic tragedy of that period, is Napoleon's assumption that the principles of the Napoleonic Code, the principles of the rights of man, the Enlightenment, and so on, are universal in their applicability. And when he conquers other parts of Europe, he takes those principles with him and tries to abolish nobility, abolish feudalism, etc., etc. But the cost in civilian life is staggering, as well as the cost in military life. And certainly French historians would see that as the primary drama of the Napoleonic period, and that the emperor makes no sense unless you're able to seize what is it that is driving this person ideologically.
Yes, really interesting.
That's about patriarchy as well, I think.
Yes, and you made that point very clearly, and that's a very interesting one, given the depiction of the relationship in the film, and in particular the depiction of Josephine, which is really interesting. There's a question for James from Gerald. He's asked, James, how you think the theme of the Nightingale might be changed if it cited the 850 years of violence, dispossession of country and colonisation that pertains to Claire's experience through her Irish nationality.
Well, I think it very explicitly does talk about that, the film. I mean, there are sequences of there are a series of fireside chats in which Billy and Claire sort of talk to each other and their kind of histories are revealed. And Claire makes it very obvious that, she is Irish and she's not the British. And again, this is this kind of, so it's there. Perhaps, I mean, it might be different. It might kind of, I guess, highlight that notion of a kind of shared victimhood even more if you saw kind of the stuff going on with the Irish dispossession before or even during the scenes of the Nightingale. I guess the sort of two sides to the same coin story, the victim, the Aboriginal victim and the convict victim as being kind of the same is I think an idea that we should question a bit, particularly in the context of frontier Tasmania. You know, until Claire is kind of violently raped and sort of her life gets turned upside down, she doesn't sort of consider Billy's plight. She has a child, she has a house on, you know, on stolen land. She is there to stay. So she is in part, you know, she is part of the settler colonial project in and of itself. And I think that's where the kind of murkiness that Berendt is talking about in terms of Kent's navigating the film's kind of, I guess, power politics get a bit tricky and murky, because she kind of plays both hands, I guess. She does make quite a lot of emphasis on the fact that, you know, these are kind of similar victims and they're shared victims of colonization. Yet at the same time, she is trying to, I guess, talk to I guess, the power hierarchies at that particular moment. And we do see moments in which Claire is quite racist towards Billy, particularly at the beginning of the film, and that kind of softens at the end. And then Billy's kind of, I guess, you know, trauma is deeper explored towards the end of the film. So I guess my answer to your question would be, if we saw the Irish being dispossessed in kind of more detail, it would probably just heighten that kind of that shared victimhood narrative, which is a narrative that gets pulled out all the time in really interesting ways. You know, Peter mentioned Jacinta Napier-Price before. You know, we might remember in the recent Voice, sort of the debates about the Voice, she stood up and gave that really interesting press club speech in which she said, well, if, you know, Aboriginal people are dispossessed, then I should be doubly dispossessed because I have convict heritage as well. And so it was this interesting kind of moment in which, again, we see this sort of idea of the shared victimhood of the convict and Aboriginal person used this time for quite explicit political purposes.
And it actually takes Claire a very long time before she stops calling Billy boy.
Boy, yes, that's right. Yeah,
which is the absolute erasure of personhood, I suppose.
Yes,
yeah.
Which I think is one of the film's real charming aspects. Well, not charming, but it's sort of, you know, you learn more about Billy's trauma as it goes on, and then it sort of just it evolves and takes over the second half of the film, which I think is quite cleverly done.
Yes. We've had a question. It's addressed to you, Peter, but it possibly applies to both. I don't know. Would you say it's accurate to describe Ridley Scott's manner of depicting history as Walt Disney-esque for adults? There are considerable errors, but this plants the seeds in persons for further appreciation of history, and perhaps that way they might turn to more rigorous study of it.
Yes, I have a sympathy for that point of view. I'm being very generous to Scott, because I think that history films that have large numbers of people wanting to go and see them and that have a serious intent, I tend to be very tolerant of. And that's one of the points that I was wanting to make, that even though historians have got every right to and they have catalogued scores and scores and scores of historical mistakes in the film, we do need to remember it's a creative work. And it attracted huge audiences, and I suspect that a lot of those audiences left wanting to know more. I mean, when it first came out, I gave a talk at one of the opening nights of it in Melbourne, and there were a huge number of people who wanted to talk about, is this true? Is it really, you know, what do you make of the film? And I think there is a way in which a film like this, even though it's replete with simplicities and mistakes, it does actually draw people in. So yes, Walt Disney-esque, I agree. But I think that at least it does have the merit of exposing people to some spectacularly filmed ways of asking questions about a key period in the past, and we should, to some extent, be grateful for that. But that doesn't mean that we therefore suspend historical judgment. I mean, I think that in the end, we have to be prepared to say what's wrong with a film like this is not so much that it's littered with specific inaccuracies, but that it just misses it misses the point. It misses the the feel of truth about the past.
It's interesting that the people who were asking you questions were concerned to know whether it was accurate. That was important to them, obviously.
Oh yes, and I do think that a film like this does lead a lot of people who see it to walk out not thinking, oh, so it was a documentary that we saw. I think a lot of people do walk out saying, oh, so is that the case, or I wonder if that was right. And I do think that historical blockbusters can have that particular impact on people. So even though we might despair at how lopsided they are, at least they do have the effect of getting people to be open to talking about the past.
Yes, yes, indeed. James, question for you from David. Given that Australia is home to the longest continual Indigenous culture, when do you think we'll see a film on the amazing Dreamtime stories or real stories of Aboriginal heroes?
You should watch a film called Ten Canoes, which I think is probably my favorite Australian film of all time, which is set in, you could argue it's kind of set in the Dreamtime. But that is an amazing film and does that very admirably. Rolf de Heer made it in, oh God, I think it was around the same time as, a bit earlier than The Nightingale. But an amazing film if you haven't seen it, is very much about I guess exploring modes of storytelling, such as dreaming. I mean, it's hard to sort of categorize the dreaming because it's such an interesting and expansive and huge logos, and I don't pretend to know anything about it. But the film goes some way to kind of exploring that world. I mean, the backstory of that particular film, of the Ten Canoes film, how Rolf de Heer, the filmmaker, went up to the Ramanginian community, made it with the film, made it with the community. The community had so much say in that representation of history, and the way that film was produced. Certain actors had to be, because it was based on an anthropologist's photographs, Donald Thompson, who took a bunch of photographs of canoeists on this kind of lake up in the Arafura swamp. And so people that played characters that related to Donald Thompson's photograph had to have kinship connection. So even the casting of the film was done in a very, very different way to how, a normal kind of Western film would be cast. And yeah, it's just so beautiful. And the wonderful thing about that film, I think, is, and perhaps this is what David's, I guess, signaling to me in his question, is that it's pre-contact, and it's outside of all of this stuff. It's sort of away from all of the kind of settler colonial narratives that so inhabit Australian historical cinema, and that's really lovely. It's actually a lovely salve to kind of watch this film. It's an absolute joyous film to watch. I couldn't recommend it more strongly.
Agreed.
Terrific. Yeah. There's an interesting question and observation from Laura, which relates, James, to a point you made about the moment of the film, of the Nightingale's release, the Uluru Statement of the Heart and all the rest of it, and its focus on truth-telling. But she then says she wanted to ask Peter about the authenticity of Napoleon and its silences, and what you think about the silence around slavery in particular, and whether this speaks to representations of Napoleon as an individual or the political and social moment that we're in now. It's an interesting question about race and power and audiences' understanding of what is historically significant. So that's a very big question. If you can disentangle all of that, and either of you might wish to comment on the moment of the creation of films and what that means.
It's interesting because and it's why I think that Scott's depiction of Napoleon is sort of so old-fashioned in a way, because it's a long time now. It's decades now since there was the National Day of memory about the history of slavery in France under President Chirac. And there's been 30 years of very significant steps in that direction, a National Day of recognition and so on. But the fact that he misses that, I think, just shows how old-fashioned the film is in a way, because certainly French audiences would be very receptive to that great ambiguity in Napoleon. How can this how can this man, which bestrides our history, with such a great general, with such ideals about European unity and all the rest of it, how could he be involved in actually trying to reimpose slavery on people who'd been free for 6 years? How could that be? And I think people in France would be utterly receptive to that ambiguity about Napoleon. So just a really significant missed opportunity for Scott to draw that out, and also to make another link with Josephine in terms of her colonial background.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
James, did you want to?
I think that's such a perceptive question. I think the wonderful thing that films can do as kind of cultural artifacts is tell us so much about kind of historical thinking at the time in which they are released. You know, they kind of operate on two levels, don't they? There's sort of the representation itself, and then there's the kind of discourses that the film prompts within that kind of moment and how it intersects with all sorts of ideas about the past. In terms of the Nightingale, what's interesting as well is you can think about the moment, but you can also think about the geography of the film. So in Australia, there were all these questions raised about sort of Uluru Statement, you know, the film is truth-telling or not, or where it sort of got murky in terms of its race politics versus its focus on gender. Whereas in somewhere like America, where it was released, the film was seen as very much a film of the Me Too moment, which was blowing up at that time. So it was seen as this kind of feminist revenge film that was speaking absolutely to the kind of gender politics of that particular time. So again, there's kind of interesting echoes of Journey Among Women in the 1970s and second wave feminism at that time. So
fascinating. Yes. I think we've worked our way through many of the questions. Apologies to those of you if I missed one of your questions, but thank you very much for all of them, because I think you'll agree, James and Peter, that there were some really interesting observations and questions that came up tonight. Terrific. And a great credit to both of you, because the papers were just terrific, fascinating, thought-provoking, and absolutely to the point. So it was terrific.
Thank you,
So
Peter.
thank you, everybody.
Thanks, James.
All of our audience. Yep.
Thanks, everyone. Yes.
Thank you.
So special thanks to both of you, Peter McPhee and James Findlay. And thanks too to our colleagues behind the scenes, Rowan Howard of Monash University, who manages the webinar so seamlessly every time, Stephanie Holt of the History Council of Victoria, and the social media, if any of you have had an eye spare for that, is all managed by Molly McHugh behind the scenes too. So thank you to all of those people. Now I'm going to share my screen just again for a moment while we wrap up. Special thanks to our sponsors, Monash University Publishing, who offer a special gift to each of our speakers. And there's just a little selection of some of what is on offer from time to time up there on the screen now. And a brief plug for our next seminar, which will be held at the same time on Thursday, the 26th of September. And the topic, and I've momentarily just lost my control button, so we'll just have to operate on that one. Thursday, 26th of September, on the topic Oral History, Migration, Generations. So I hope you can join us again for that one. And finally, thank you so much for you as our audience for your attendance and participation tonight. The recording of tonight's event will be available in a few days' time on the History Council's YouTube site. So keep a watch out for it and send it on to your friends. And thank you, everybody, and good night.